AITA for letting my wife divorce me for properties she didn't know my mom owns. Cassandra stood in the middle of our living room with a measuring tape and the air of a conqueror claiming new land, giving instructions to an imaginary interior designer about where she would place her new quartz crystal collection once I was out of the picture. She looked at me with such rehearsed pity that I almost asked for her autograph, convinced that her retirement plan, funded by my hard work, was an unshakable universal law. I still can't figure out how someone can have the audacity to measure the windows for new drapes in a house that legally belongs to them as much as the moon does. But I suppose an excess of burning sage ends up clouding one's judgment. Our 7-year history could be summed up by a scale where I put in the work and she put in the positive energy, while I was grinding away, working double shifts at the logistics firm so we wouldn't want for anything. Cassandra dedicated herself to a tireless search for her true passion, which conveniently always involved spiritual retreats in Sedona or yoga workshops in Ojai, all paid for with my credit card. She operated under a very peculiar financial philosophy. Whatever she earned from the occasional part-time gig was her private, fun money. But my paycheck was our shared household fund, destined to finance her enlightenment. For a long time, I made the mistake of normalizing that strategic laziness, thinking my role as a provider was the natural engine of our stability. I got used to her speeches about the universe's abundance, which curiously always arrived in the form of my direct deposits on the 15th and 30th of the month. Cassandra spoke of our future and our property with a certainty that made me feel like a simple administrator of her comfort. It didn't matter that I hadn't had a weekend off in 3 years. To her, my effort was simply the tribute that destiny paid her for existing. The blinders fell from my eyes in the most mundane way possible, a slip-up with her phone's speaker. I heard her talking to one of her friends from her manifestation circle, explaining with surgical coldness that she would divorce me as soon as the house was paid off. She called me the necessary dead weight and detailed how she planned to live off the short-term rental income while I looked for a studio apartment on the outskirts of town. In her head, I was just the financing tool that was reaching its expiration date. That afternoon, instead of shouting or confronting her, I felt an absolute, almost educational calm. I decided that if she wanted to play real estate chess, I was going to move the pieces with the precision of a jaded clerk at the county records office. I spoke with my mother, Eleanor, a woman who knows more about contracts than she does about cooking, and explained the situation. We agreed that the money to pay off the mortgage would come directly from her savings account, the fruit of a legitimate inheritance she had received, and that the deed would reflect the technical reality. She was the buyer and absolute owner. I continued to play my role as the long-suffering, silent husband for the following months, letting her continue to dream of her short-term rental empire. Cassandra kept spending on expensive furniture and planning renovations, assuming my silence was her victory. Every time she talked to me about how our house would gain value, I simply nodded with a smile that she interpreted as tiredness, but which was actually pure anticipation. I made sure that every penny invested in that house had my mother's legal trail, leaving not a single loose thread. Finally, Cassandra's big move came on a Monday morning, just after I made the coffee. She handed me the divorce papers with an almost heroic self-satisfaction, as if she were doing me a favor by freeing me from her presence. She had that look of someone who thinks they've just won the lottery without ever buying a ticket. I took the documents, glanced over them, and agreed with her on everything, maintaining an expression of feigned defeat that she devoured with pride. I told her I perfectly understood her need for space and that I wouldn't obstruct the process, which seemed to inflate her ego to stratospheric levels. She asked me to start looking for a place to live, reminding me that the house was her emotional security and that she would stay there to manage the rental business. It was fascinating to watch her proclaim herself the owner of a castle in the sky, ignoring that the ground beneath her feet was no longer what she thought it was. That night, while she celebrated her supposed independence in the master bedroom, I finished packing my personal belongings with a peace I hadn't felt in years. There was no hatred, only a scientific curiosity to see how long it would take for her to hit the wall of legal reality. She watched me carry the boxes and gave me self-improvement advice, never suspecting that the dead weight was taking with him the only connection she had to the property. I left her installed in her fantasy, surrounded by furniture she couldn't afford and business plans based on a non-existent premise. Cassandra felt like the smartest woman in town, a strategist who had managed to squeeze 7 years of my life to obtain a free asset. I just said goodbye with a good luck with the process, knowing that luck was the one thing she wasn't going to find in the courts. Update 1. A week has passed since Cassandra handed me the divorce papers, and her level of delusion has escalated to levels that defy logic. With blind confidence in her supposed triumph, she decided the first thing she should do was quit her administrative job because, according to her, she needed to heal her lineage and dedicate herself fully to her new role as a real estate entrepreneur. I got the impression she felt like the mastermind of the century as she explained to me, in a condescending tone, that I should move into a small apartment soon so she could list the house on short-term rental platforms. I didn't contradict her at all. I simply nodded and even suggested she start buying new furniture so the business would have a premium aesthetic. Watching her spend her last savings on linen cushions and abstract paintings for a property that doesn't belong to her was a spectacle of dark humor. Cassandra strolled through the neighborhood asking for recommendations for contractors and a cleaning service, introducing herself as the new owner who had come to elevate the area's profile. I found it incredibly embarrassing to see her act like the owner of a real estate empire in front of people who have known me my whole life. Meanwhile, I had already rented a comfortable, modern apartment, watching as she burned her bridges with no port in sight. The real chaos began to brew when her lawyer, who at first seemed to share her enthusiasm, asked for the original property documents to formalize the division of assets. Cassandra, convinced the papers were where they always were, went to look in the home safe and found only appliance manuals and expired warranties. Her reaction wasn't doubt, but blind fury, immediately assuming I had stolen her inheritance. She called me at work screaming, accusing me of being a criminal for taking our house documents, without processing that the documents were never in our name. I responded with a calmness that seemed to irritate her even more, suggesting she check her memories about who signed what during the purchase. She insisted that as a married couple, any paper I had signed included her by divine and legal right. It was at that moment I realized her stubbornness wasn't just a character trait, but a complete disconnect from how the real world works. Cassandra genuinely believes her will is enough to alter public records and property titles. That same afternoon, I returned to the house to pick up my last belongings and found her rummaging through every drawer with an almost comical desperation. She asked me where the deeds were with the tone of someone interrogating a burglar who had broken into their own home. I just reminded her that transparency was important and that everything would be clarified at the settlement meeting. She shot me a look of contempt, convinced I was hiding the papers in some secret place, never suspecting the originals were safe and sound in my mother's safe deposit box. The tension in the house became unbearable, but not because of me, but because of her inability to accept that things weren't going according to her script. Cassandra started sending messages to her friends, saying I was trying to sabotage her healing venture and that I was an economic abuser. I was amazed to see how someone could build a victim narrative on such a blatant foundation of greed. To her, the fact that I wasn't handing her the house on a silver platter was a personal affront to her happiness. The immediate cost to me was dealing with the glares of some neighbors who bought her story of the displaced female entrepreneur. However, I preferred to keep a low profile and let her keep digging her own hole. Every new piece of furniture that arrived at the house was, in my mind, another nail in her personal finance coffin. I knew she didn't have much money left in her bank account and was betting everything on a legal victory that would never come. The end of that week was a scene worthy of a screwball comedy. Cassandra bought a very expensive smart lock for the front door, installing it herself to secure her investment. I had to laugh, thinking she was protecting a property she would soon be evicted from, spending money she didn't have on a security that wouldn't protect her from the law. She gave me a copy of the virtual key with an arrogance that said, "I'm in charge here." And I accepted it with a sincere, "thank you" that she couldn't interpret. Update 2. A month has passed, and we finally had our first settlement meeting with the lawyers in an office that smelled of cheap coffee and other people's problems. Everything was going fine until Cassandra's lawyer, a woman who seemed to have taken too many aggressive empowerment courses, triumphantly demanded the award of 50% of the marital property. She expounded for 10 minutes on her client's emotional labor and how the house was the core of her life project. My lawyer, who has seen more divorces than baptisms, simply waited for her speech to end before sliding a laminated document across the table, the official property deed. On the paper, my mother, Eleanor, was listed as the sole and absolute owner of the property from the day of purchase. The silence that followed was so heavy you could almost hear the thoughts of Cassandra's lawyer trying to recalculate her strategy. Cassandra, for her part, turned red, not from embarrassment, but from that litigious stubbornness that defines her. Instead of shutting up, she started shouting that this was spiritual fraud because she herself had chosen the pearl gray color of the facade, and that, according to her logic, granted her automatic rights. She argued to the mediator, who by now didn't know where to look, that the act of supervising the decoration and watering the garden made her the de facto owner through emotional possession. She completely ignored all private property laws, insisting that the universe doesn't recognize names on pieces of paper, but the energy invested in a home. The immediate effect was that her own lawyer stared at the deed with an expression of wanting the earth to swallow her whole, probably calculating how much time she would waste on a lost cause. I dedicated myself to cleaning my glasses with deliberate slowness and asked her if she needed a tissue for her personal branding crisis. The meeting fell apart quickly when my lawyer explained that the money for the purchase came from a legitimate inheritance from my mother and that I had only acted as the administrator of her paperwork. Legally, the house was never part of the marital estate because it was never mine, not hers, not ours. Cassandra began accusing me of having deceived her for years, forgetting that she was the one who always said, "What's mine is mine," never suspecting I would apply the same rule, but with the backing of the law. Her outrage was almost artistic. She felt betrayed by reality itself. Upon leaving the office, she tried to intercept me in the hallway to tell me this wasn't over and that she would seek experts in universal laws to challenge the deed. I got the impression she still hadn't processed that a judge doesn't accept tarot card readings as proof of ownership. I just reminded her that the payments for the furniture she bought on her credit card would soon start accruing interest and that maybe she should worry about that before the pearl gray facade. She called me a cynic, which I took as the best compliment I've received in years. The situation at the house became ridiculous. She refused to leave, claiming she was on a sacred occupation strike. She started sending me emails full of made-up legal terms mixed with self-help phrases, demanding compensation for the years she spent beautifying my life. My response was always the same: forward everything to the lawyers and remind her that my mother is a force to be reckoned with when it comes to her assets. Eleanor was already asking when she could enter her house to change the locks. The most ironic part of all was watching Cassandra try to convince her friends that she was a victim of a patriarchal real estate conspiracy. Some believed her at first, but when they found out the house was in my mother's name and not mine, they began to distance themselves. Nobody wants to be near someone fighting for something that legally belongs to their mother-in-law. Cassandra's pattern of chaos became so evident that even the decorator she had hired stopped answering her messages when he saw there were no funds to pay his fees. Despite everything, she doubled down and decided she didn't need her lawyer, who wisely resigned from the case that same week. Cassandra announced she would represent herself because the truth has its own language. I just sat back and watched as her strategy of stubbornness led her straight towards a financial cliff. I knew the next step would be the final one, and I was more than ready to give her that final push that poetic justice demands. Update 3. Another month has passed, and the situation has transformed into a comedy of legal errors starring exclusively Cassandra. Everything was going fine until she, after being abandoned by her original lawyer, decided her best defense was a direct offense on physical ground. She showed up at my mother's house on a Tuesday afternoon with a spiral notebook and a measuring tape, demanding to be allowed to take an inventory of the bricks. According to her new legal theory, even if the house wasn't hers, the construction materials purchased during our marriage belonged to her proportionally. Eleanor, who has a patience forged by decades of dealing with difficult people, simply closed the door in her face while Cassandra screamed from the sidewalk that the universe would litigate in her favor. It was a pathetic and fascinating spectacle at the same time. The neighbors came out to see who the woman trying to count the bricks on the facade with her finger was. I understood her stubbornness was sinking her into a bottomless pit when I learned from a mutual friend that she had taken out a very expensive personal loan. She applied for it based on what she called expected earnings from the divorce judgment, convinced the judge would award her a fortune for her years of emotional service. Watching her sink financially due to her own arrogance was the motivation I needed to give her the final push. Through my lawyer, I sent her a notarized letter requesting payment of retroactive rent for all the months she had lived in my mother's house without a lease agreement. Since we are now legal strangers, and she no longer has the protection of marriage to occupy a third party's property, the debt began to accumulate with the speed of a lightning bolt. She responded with a text message full of insults, claiming I was an energy vampire trying to steal her peace. Cassandra then attempted a desperate maneuver. She tried to sue my mother for unjust enrichment, arguing that the improvements she made, like changing the doorknobs, had increased the property's value. My lawyer almost fell out of his chair laughing when he read the handwritten lawsuit. The judge, of course, didn't even accept the filing, but she took it as a sign that the system was corrupted by low vibrations. Every step she took buried her deeper in a mountain of legal and personal debts she had created herself. I got the impression that Cassandra no longer distinguished between a courthouse and a yoga retreat. She would show up to preliminary hearings with crystals in her pockets and try to connect with the mediator through eye contact, completely ignoring questions about concrete facts. Meanwhile, the bank that gave her the personal loan began to call her insistently, as she hadn't paid a single installment, waiting for the money from the big settlement that would never come. Her real estate fantasy world was crumbling on all four sides. The most incredible moment was when she tried to claim a right to the front lawn, alleging that she had personally watered it twice in the summer of 2021. According to her, that act of care gave her a legal right to use the land. My mother, upon hearing this, simply commented that if she wanted the lawn, she could come with a shovel and take it, as long as she filled the hole with soil of the same quality. Cassandra's ability to ignore the concept of real property was truly astonishing and, at this point, frankly comical. At this point, I no longer felt any responsibility for her situation. She had had multiple opportunities to exit with dignity, but chose to bet on a lie she herself started to believe. Cassandra's stubbornness became her own prison. She was so obsessed with beating me that she didn't realize she had already lost everything she truly had: her job, her savings, and her reputation. I just dedicated myself to documenting every one of her mistakes for the final judgment, making sure karma had all the necessary evidence. The end of this stage was the formal eviction notice my mother finally signed. When Cassandra received the notification, she posted on her social media that she was the victim of a spiritual eviction and needed donations to keep fighting for justice. No one donated anything. Her own friends wrote comments suggesting she get a job and stop the nonsense, but she blocked them, accusing them of being low-frequency people. The stage was set for the final act, where her self-sabotage engine would finally explode. Update 4. The checkmate was so clean and decisive that for a microsecond, I almost felt pity. But then I remembered her detailed plan to leave me on the street, and the feeling passed faster than a sneeze. On the day of the final judgment, Cassandra showed up without a lawyer, wearing a white linen dress and carrying a folder full of photos of herself posing in front of the pearl gray facade. The judge, a man with a face that had seen it all, listened to her patiently for 20 minutes as she argued that love is a de facto co-ownership and that her physical presence had blessed the foundations of the house, granting her legal rights above any deed. When the judge finally spoke, it wasn't to agree with her. but to dismiss all her claims with a legal coldness that cut through the air. He not only ruled that she had no right to Eleanor's property, but he also ordered her to pay all court costs for litigating in bad faith, citing her blatant attempt to manipulate the system with arguments lacking any legal basis. Cassandra sat frozen in her seat, watching her spiritual house of cards collapse before an official seal and a signature. Since she had quit her job months ago and spent her last savings on luxury furniture for a house that wasn't hers, she suddenly found herself with a massive bank debt from the personal loan and not a single dollar to cover the legal fees. The poetic justice was completed just 3 days later when Eleanor initiated the formal eviction process with the sheriff's department. Cassandra had to leave the property with her suitcases full of designer clothes and her quartz crystals, but without a single cent to pay for a taxi to take her anywhere. It was an image worthy of an indie film, Cassandra standing on the sidewalk, surrounded by her linen cushions and abstract paintings, trying to convince the officers that her energy was still linked to the zip code. Her engine of self-sabotage, that unbreakable stubbornness of believing the rules didn't apply to her because she was special, left her living on the couch of a friend who now looks at her with barely concealed contempt. She took her furniture, yes, but she ended up selling it for a fraction of its price on social media just to be able to eat. I, on the other hand, now live in the house, but this time with a legal lease agreement, paying a symbolic rent to my mother. I enjoy a priceless peace in a home that no longer has to finance delusions of grandeur or spiritual retreats. The first thing I did was paint the facade a deep olive green, just to erase any trace of the pearl gray she so loudly claimed as her own. The silence in the afternoons is now my best company. Cassandra tried to send me one last message a couple of weeks ago, saying that this wasn't over and that the universe's justice would come for me in the form of a financial collapse. My spam blocker did its job perfectly, just like my life, which no longer accepts her noise or her interference. She remains convinced she is a martyr of the system, while I simply see her as a costly but necessary lesson on the limits of tolerance. Epilogue. Just a few days ago, I received some excellent news. I've been promoted to regional director at my job, which comes with a bonus I'm already using to plan a month-long trip to Japan. Meanwhile, a friend told me he saw Cassandra working as a perfume demonstrator at a local mall. Apparently, she spends her days trying to convince strangers that her essence is superior and that the scent she's selling can change their destiny, even though she couldn't smell the disaster heading her way until the door was shut in her face. If you like the stories, don't forget to leave a comment and support the channel by subscribing. See you in the upcoming stories.